The winter wind howled down the streets of Chicago like a hungry animal, sending icy fingers through every gap in Sophia's thin jacket. She pulled it tighter around her body with one hand, the other clutching her violin case to her chest as if it were a shield. 3 days since she'd had a proper meal, 3 weeks since she'd arrived in America, 3 months since her world had fallen apart. The restaurant's golden light spilled onto the sidewalk, a warm promise in the gathering darkness. Sophia stood across the street watching people laughing inside, their plates piled high with food she could only imagine, her stomach cramped painfully, a feeling she was getting used to. The smell of cooking reached her even through the cold air, rich spices, baking bread, roasting meat. "Just ask," she whispered to herself, her breath forming small clouds. The worst they can say is no. But rejection wasn't just a word when you had nowhere else to go. Sophia had already tried 2 other restaurants tonight. The first owner had barely looked at her before pointing to the door. The second had at least seemed sorry when he shook his head. A young couple walked past her toward the restaurant, their shoulders touching, faces bright with anticipation of a good meal. Sophia watched them enter, then took a deep breath that seemed to reach all the way down to her empty stomach. She stepped off the curb, dodged a passing taxi, and approached the glowing entrance of Angelo's Italian Bistro. The warmth hit her first when she pushed open the door, then the wall of sound, clinking glasses, laughter, conversations rising and falling like waves, and underneath it all, barely audible music from speakers mounted near the ceiling. The hostess station stood empty, but Sophia could see a man in a crisp white shirt and black vest arranging menus nearby. His graying hair was slicked back, and his movements were quick and efficient, like someone who had been doing the same job for many years. Sophia waited, one hand still gripping her violin case, the other nervously tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She hadn't looked in a mirror for days, but she knew what she must look like. Unwashed hair, hollow cheeks, clothes that hung too loosely on her frame. The man in the vest looked up, noticing her at last. His eyes took her in quickly, professionally, and Sophia saw the moment his expression changed from potential customer to unwelcome problem. "We're fully booked tonight," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "No walk-ins." Sophia swallowed hard. "I'm not looking for a table," she said in careful English, her accent making the words sound stiff and foreign to her own ears. "I was wondering." She stopped, gathered her courage, and lifted her violin case slightly. "May I play for a serving of food?" The man's eyebrows rose. Behind him at a nearby table, Sophia heard someone laugh. She kept her eyes on the man's face, refusing to look and see who was amused by her desperation. "We have a sound system," the man said, gesturing vaguely toward the ceiling. "We don't need live music." "Please," Sophia said, hating the tremor in her voice. "Just one song. For something to eat, anything." The laughter grew louder from somewhere to her right, and this time Sophia couldn't help but look. 4 men in business suits sat around a table covered with plates and wine glasses. They were watching her, one of them leaning back in his chair with an amused smile. "Hey, Raj," the smiling man called to the host. "Let's see what the street performer can do." "Dinner and a show, right?" Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks. The host, Raj, looked uncomfortable, caught between getting rid of her and possibly entertaining his customers. "This isn't that kind of establishment," Raj said, turning back to Sophia. "I'm sorry, but let her play, Raj," another voice called from across the restaurant. An older woman with white hair tied back in a neat bun stood up from her table. "I'd like to hear it." Raj looked torn, glancing between Sophia and what was clearly a regular customer. Finally, he sighed and gestured toward a small open area near the bar. "One song," he said quietly to Sophia. "Make it good, or make it quick." Sophia clutched her violin case tighter, nodding gratefully. She walked to the spot he'd indicated, feeling eyes following her. The business table continued to chatter and laugh, one man making an exaggerated conductor motion with his fork. The older woman who had spoken up for her watched with interest, setting down her wine glass and giving Sophia an encouraging nod. The case creaked as Sophia opened it, revealing her one treasure. The violin wasn't new or particularly valuable by professional standards, but it had been her grandfather's and then her father's before becoming hers. The wood glowed with years of careful polishing, dark and rich against the faded blue velvet lining of the case. Sophia lifted it out with reverence, then took the bow, quickly tightening it. As she positioned the violin under her chin, a strange calm settled over her. The hunger, the cold, the stares, they all faded away. There was only the familiar weight of the instrument, the feel of the strings beneath her fingers. This at least hadn't changed when everything else had. Sophia drew a breath and began to play. The first notes of Tchaikovsky's violin concerto floated across the restaurant. Not the full orchestral piece, but her own adaptation that carried the soul of it. Her fingers found the notes without conscious thought, muscle memory taking over where hunger had weakened her mind. At first, no one seemed to notice. The businessmen continued their conversation. A waiter moved between tables, but then like a ripple spreading outward, the talking slowed. Heads turned. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Sophia kept her eyes closed, letting the music fill her empty spaces. The violin sang of everything she couldn't say, the home she'd fled, the family left behind, the fear and loneliness and hope that had carried her across an ocean. Her body swayed slightly as the melody built, her thin frame somehow containing all the power the piece demanded. By the time she reached the middle section, the restaurant had fallen completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had paused, standing in the doorway to listen. The businessmen who had laughed sat motionless, drinks forgotten in their hands. Raj stood with menus clutched to his chest, his expression one of disbelief. Sophia didn't see any of this. She was somewhere else entirely, back in the conservatory where she'd studied, in the concert hall where she'd once performed as the youngest first violin in her country's national orchestra, in her family's small living room where her father had first placed the tiny instrument in her 5-year-old hands. When the final note faded, Sophia opened her eyes to silence. For a horrible moment, she thought they had hated it so much they couldn't even respond. Then the applause began, tentative at first, then building until it filled the room as completely as her music had moments before. The older woman who had spoken up for her was on her feet, clapping with tears in her eyes. Several other diners had stood as well. The businessmen looked stunned, their earlier mockery replaced by something that might have been shame. Raj approached her, shaking his head in wonder. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked as the applause continued. "The National Conservatory," Sophia replied quietly. Before they closed it, understanding flickered in his eyes. Everyone had seen the news reports of the political upheaval in her country, though few understood what it meant for ordinary people caught in the chaos. "Kitchen," Raj said, gesturing for her to follow him. "You'll eat in the kitchen?" Sophia carefully returned the violin to its case and followed him through the swinging doors into the bright, steamy heart of the restaurant. The cooks and dishwashers nodded to her, one giving a small bow. Raj pointed to a stool in the corner. "Sit," he ordered, then turned to the head cook. "Give her whatever she wants. It's on the house." The cook, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes, smiled at Sophia. "How about everything? You look like you need everything." 10 minutes later, Sophia sat with a plate piled high before her. Pasta with rich tomato sauce, garlic bread dripping with butter, roasted vegetables, and a small steak on the side. She tried to eat slowly to maintain some dignity, but hunger won out. Each bite was better than the last, flavors she had almost forgotten existed. She was halfway through when the kitchen doors swung open again. The white-haired woman who had first spoken up for her entered, scanning the room until she spotted Sophia. "There you are," she said, making her way between busy cooks with the confidence of someone used to commanding a room. She sat on a stool across from Sophia, studying her face. "I'm Eleanor," she said, extending her hand. "Eleanor Whitman." Sophia wiped her fingers on a napkin and shook the offered hand. "Sophia Mendez." "Sophia," Eleanor repeated as if testing the name. "Do you know who I am?" Sophia shook her head, then took another bite of food. Eleanor smiled, not offended by the lack of recognition or the priority Sophia gave to her meal. "I was the conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra for 25 years, she said simply. "I retired last spring." Sophia's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Everyone in the classical music world knew that name. "You play like someone who has suffered," Eleanor continued, "but also like someone who refuses to be defined by suffering." She leaned forward. "Tell me your story, Sophia, and when you're done, I'd like to tell you about an audition happening next week at the Palmer Music Academy." Sophia looked down at her plate. then at her violin case, then back at this woman who had appeared like a character from a story too hopeful to believe. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Outside, the winter wind continued to howl, but inside, something that had been frozen for months began to thaw. Sophia woke before sunrise in a strange bed. For a moment, panic gripped her as she stared at an unfamiliar ceiling. Then the events of the previous night flooded back: the restaurant, her playing, the meal, and Eleanor Whitman. The small guest room was simply furnished but felt like luxury after weeks of sleeping in shelters or on the worst nights in train stations. She sat up slowly, her body still aching from hunger and cold that couldn't be fixed with just one good meal. The clock on the bedside table read 5:43 a.m. Old habits died hard. Back home, she had risen at 5 every morning to practice before school, and then again after classes at the conservatory. Discipline was what had made her good enough for first violin. Discipline might be all she had left. Sophia slipped out of bed, careful not to make noise. Eleanor lived alone in this spacious apartment overlooking Grant Park. But Sophia didn't want to disturb her host, who had already shown her such unexpected kindness. She took her violin case from where it rested against the wall and unlatched it with practiced hands. The familiar weight of the instrument brought comfort as she lifted it to her shoulder, not playing yet, just holding it, reconnecting. "You're up early." Eleanor's voice came from the doorway, making Sophia jump slightly. The older woman stood there in a silk robe, a steaming mug in her hand. "Don't stop on my account. This place hasn't heard nearly enough music since I retired." Sophia lowered the violin. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. Conductors rise early, too." Eleanor entered the room and sat in a chair by the window. "Play something. Anything you like." Sophia hesitated only briefly before raising her bow. She chose Bach this time, simpler than Tchaikovsky but no less beautiful. The notes filled the small room, bouncing off the walls, alive and vibrant in the early morning light. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. When Sophia finished the piece, the older woman nodded once, decisively, as if confirming something to herself. "The audition is Thursday," she said, opening her eyes. 3 days from now. We have work to do." The next 72 hours passed in a blur. Eleanor's spacious living room became Sophia's practice space, its large windows letting in sunlight during the day and reflecting the city lights at night. The elder musician was a demanding teacher, interrupting frequently, demonstrating technique, pushing Sophia to find depths in the music she hadn't explored before. "Again," Eleanor would say, tapping her finger against her chin. "You're playing the notes perfectly, but I don't believe them yet." When Sophia's fingers ached too badly to continue, they talked. Eleanor explained the Palmer Music Academy, one of the most prestigious in the country, with connections to major orchestras and opportunities that could reshape a young musician's future. They have 2 scholarship spots opening for their special talent program. Eleanor explained over a simple dinner of soup and bread. The competition will be fierce. These are students who have been preparing for years with private tutors and the best instruments. Sophia stirred her soup, appetite suddenly diminished. "Why are you helping me? There must be dozens of students you know who deserve this chance." Eleanor set down her spoon and studied Sophia with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I've conducted orchestras for nearly 40 years. I've worked with some of the finest musicians in the world." She leaned forward slightly. "What you have can't be taught. Technique, theory, even discipline, those can be learned. But the soul in your playing? That's rare." She reached across the table and tapped Sophia's chest lightly. "In here you understand what the music is saying. You've lived enough to know its language. That's what I heard in that restaurant." Sophia looked down, uncomfortable with the praise. "In my country there were many better players." "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded. "But they aren't here playing for meals in Chicago restaurants, you are. And on Thursday you're going to show the Palmer Committee exactly what I heard." The morning of the audition dawned gray and threatening rain. Sophia stood in front of the mirror in Eleanor's guest bathroom, barely recognizing herself. The borrowed dress was simple but elegant, making her look like the serious musician she had been before her world collapsed. Eleanor had taken her shopping for shoes the day before. No one plays their best when their feet hurt, and had insisted on having Sophia's hair trimmed. "Ready?" Eleanor asked, appearing in the doorway. Sophia's stomach churned with anxiety. What if they ask about my papers? My visa situation is complicated. Music first, Eleanor said firmly. Let's get you in the door with your playing. The rest we'll figure out. The Palmer Music Academy occupied an imposing stone building near the lake. Sophia clutched her violin case as they climbed the steps, each one feeling steeper than the last. Inside, the hallways echoed with snippets of music. Pianists running scales, a cellist repeating a difficult passage, vocalists warming up. They were directed to a waiting area where 7 other young musicians sat with various instruments. All of them had the polished look of students who had never missed a lesson or a meal. Sophia took a seat on a hard bench, trying not to fidget as Eleanor spoke quietly with the receptionist. A tall young man with a violin case identical to Sophia's, except newer. Chenier gave her a quick once-over. "Which conservatory are you from?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew all the possibilities. "Not from here," Sophia replied vaguely, focusing on the sheet music in her lap. "International student? Let me guess, Juilliard exchange program?" Before Sophia could answer, a door opened and a woman with a clipboard appeared. "Sophia Mendez? The committee will see you now." Eleanor squeezed her shoulder as Sophia stood. "Remember what we worked on. Play from here," she whispered, touching her heart. The audition room was larger than Sophia had expected, with high ceilings and windows that let in the gloomy daylight. 5 people sat at a long table, 3 men and 2 women, all with the serious expressions of people who had listened to too many hopeful musicians. "Ms. Mendez," said the woman in the center, consulting her notes. "It says here you were first violin with the National Orchestra in your country. That's quite an accomplishment for someone your age." Sophia nodded, not trusting her voice. "And yet we have no records from your conservatory. No transcripts. No formal recommendation letters." The woman looked up, her expression not unkind but certainly skeptical. "That's unusual for an applicant to our program." "There was political unrest," Sophia said quietly. "The conservatory was closed. The records," she trailed off, remembering the night the cultural ministry had been burned, the frantic calls, the sudden disappearances of professors and students alike. The woman nodded, her face softening slightly. "Yes, we're aware of the situation. Well, we'll have to let your playing speak for itself. What will you perform today?" Sophia had prepared Bach's Chaconne from Partita No. 2. Difficult, but she knew it by heart. As she lifted her violin, however, something else came to mind. "If it's all right," she said, surprising herself, "I'd like to play something from my home." The committee members exchanged glances. "As you wish," the woman said, making a note. Sophia positioned the violin and closed her eyes briefly. When she began to play, it wasn't Bach or Tchaikovsky or any of the European masters she had studied for years. It was a folk melody her grandmother had hummed while cooking, that street musicians played in the old town square on summer evenings, that children learned almost before they could speak. The simple tune filled the room, but Sophia didn't keep it simple for long. She began to embellish it, adding flourishes that spoke of joy and celebration, then transitioning to minor keys that hinted at the sorrows her country had endured. Her fingers danced across the strings as she wove in classical techniques with the raw emotion of folk tradition. She lost track of time as she played, lost awareness of the committee watching her. There was only the music, the story of her people, her family, herself. When the final note faded, Sophia opened her eyes to find the committee members perfectly still. The woman in the center cleared her throat. "That was unexpected," she said. "May I ask what piece that was?" "It doesn't have a name in your language," Sophia answered. "It means something like The Long Return Home." "Your own composition?" "An arrangement. The melody is traditional." The committee members made notes, their faces giving nothing away. The woman nodded once. "Thank you, Ms. Mendez. We'll be in touch with the results by the end of the week." Sophia left the room on shaky legs. Eleanor was waiting in the hallway, her expression questioning. "I didn't play what we practiced," Sophia admitted. "I played something from home instead." To her surprise, Eleanor smiled. Good. But we worked for 3 days on the Bach, and you played it beautifully in practice. But this?" Eleanor gestured toward the audition room. "This wasn't about playing what they expected. It was about making them remember you." She took Sophia's arm. "Come, let's get some lunch while we wait for them to make the most obvious decision of their careers." They were halfway down the academy steps when a voice called after them. Ms. Whitman? A moment, please. They turned to see one of the committee members, an older man with silver hair, hurrying toward them. Professor Chen, Eleanor greeted him. It's been a while. Too long, he agreed, slightly out of breath from his hurry. He looked at Sophia with intense interest. Ms. Mendez, the committee is wondering if you might have time to play for the advanced string section this afternoon. Just an informal session. We're working on a rather difficult Bartok piece, and I think they would benefit from hearing your perspective. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. That's unusual, Philip. So was her audition, he replied simply. He turned back to Sophia. What do you say? Sophia looked between them, confused by this unexpected turn. I would be honored, she said finally. Professor Chen nodded, satisfied. Excellent. 3:00 in the main rehearsal hall. He started back up the steps, then paused. And Ms. Mendez? Bring more music from home. Our students could use the education. As he disappeared into the building, Sophia turned to Eleanor, who was grinning broadly. What just happened? She asked. Eleanor linked her arm through Sophia's. What just happened, my dear, is that you've caught their attention. And in this world, that's the hardest part of all. The main rehearsal hall of Palmer Music Academy buzzed with the sound of 30 string instruments being tuned. Sophia stood just inside the doorway, clutching her violin case to her chest, suddenly uncertain. These weren't just students. They were the Academy's elite. Young musicians who had been training since they could walk, who came from families that understood what it meant to pursue this life. Eleanor gave her a gentle push forward. Go on. They're waiting. Professor Chen spotted them from across the room where he'd been speaking with a cellist. He raised a hand in greeting and made his way through the maze of music stands. Ms. Mendez. Excellent. We're just getting set up. He turned to the room and clapped his hands twice, bringing the chaotic sounds to an abrupt halt. Everyone, we have a guest today. This is Sophia Mendez, who gave quite a remarkable audition this morning. 30 pairs of eyes turned to study her. Sophia felt her cheeks warm under their scrutiny. She recognized the tall violinist from the waiting room, his expression now curious rather than dismissive. Sophia will be playing with us today, Professor Chen continued, and perhaps if we're fortunate, she'll share some of her homeland's music afterward. He led her to an empty chair in the first violin section. As she unpacked her instrument, the girl next to her leaned over. Is it true you played with a national orchestra? She whispered. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, not a strand out of place. Sophia nodded, focusing on tuning her violin. I'm Lucia, the girl offered. First chair, usually. There was no hostility in her voice, just simple fact. Professor Chen said you haven't had formal training for a while. Need any help with the Bartok? Sophia was about to refuse when she caught sight of the music on the stand they were sharing. The piece was fiendishly complex, full of time signature changes and unusual bowings. Thank you, she said instead. It's been a difficult few months. Lucia nodded as if this explained everything. Third movement is the killer. Watch me on the entrance if you get lost. Professor Chen tapped his baton on his stand and the room fell silent. From the beginning, please. And remember what we discussed about the dynamics. This should whisper, then scream, then whisper again. The first notes were hesitant, the ensemble finding its way into the difficult rhythms. Sophia followed along, sight-reading as best she could, grateful for Lucia's subtle guidance. By the end of the first page, she had caught the pattern of the piece, its deliberate dissonance, its challenging intervals designed to unsettle the ear. When they reached the third movement, Sophia understood what Lucia had meant. The time signatures shifted constantly. The melody passed between sections like a frantic game of catch. Twice she nearly lost her place, but each time Lucia's bow dipped slightly on the crucial entrance, keeping her on track. After 40 minutes of intense focus, Professor Chen lowered his baton. Much better. Still ragged in the transitions, but better. He turned to Sophia. What do you think, Ms. Mendez? Any observations from a fresh perspective? Sophia hesitated, surprised to be asked. It's a difficult piece. Indeed it is. Anything else? She took a breath, aware of the attention on her. I think you're all playing it too perfectly. A murmur ran through the ensemble. Professor Chen's eyebrows rose, but he looked intrigued rather than offended. Go on. Bartok wrote this after studying folk music, Sophia explained, warming to her point. The peasants and villagers he recorded didn't play with perfect technique. They played with feeling, with dirt under their fingernails. She gestured to the pristine players around her. It should sound a little wild, a little dangerous. The silence that followed made her wish she could take back the words. Then Professor Chen began to laugh, a deep, genuine sound. Precisely, he said, nodding. Precisely what I've been trying to tell them for weeks. He looked around at his students. You hear that? A little dirt under your fingernails, please. The rehearsal continued with renewed energy. Sophia felt herself relaxing, finding joy in the complexity of the music and the skill of the players around her. When they reached the end of the piece, the silence that followed felt charged with satisfaction. Now, Professor Chen said, setting down his baton, I believe Ms. Mendez has something to share with us. He gestured for Sophia to come to the front of the room. Sophia walked to the conductor's podium, suddenly aware of how shabby her borrowed dress looked in this room full of wealth and privilege. She pushed the thought away. Here, only the music mattered. In my country, she began, her voice quieter than she intended, we have a tradition of violin music that goes back centuries. It's not written down. It's taught by ear, passed from one generation to the next. She raised her violin and began to play a dance tune, fast and spirited, that she had learned from an old man who played in the town square on market days. Her foot tapped unconsciously as the melody spun out, her bow bouncing across the strings in the rustic style that no classical training encouraged. When she finished, she was met with silence, then enthusiastic applause. Professor Chen stepped forward. Would anyone like to try? He asked his students. Hands shot up across the room. Sophia spent the next hour teaching snippets of folk melodies, laughing at the classically trained musicians' attempts to produce the raw, sometimes gritty sounds of village fiddling. By the time Professor Chen called an end to the session, the formal atmosphere had completely dissolved. As students packed up their instruments, many stopped to speak with Sophia, asking questions about her country, her training, her journey. Lucia lingered until the others had gone. You're really good, she said simply. Are you joining the academy? Sophia shrugged. I auditioned for the scholarship program. But there are complications. Lucia seemed about to ask more when Eleanor approached, deep in conversation with Professor Chen. Can be arranged, he was saying. The dean owes me a favor or two. Eleanor noticed Sophia waiting and smiled. Good news, she said. The committee has made a decision already. They'd like to offer you the scholarship position. Sophia's breath caught. Already? But they said by the end of the week. Sometimes we know immediately, Professor Chen interrupted gently. Your playing this morning was exceptional, and your contribution today only confirmed what we heard. Joy rushed through Sophia, followed immediately by anxiety. What about my situation? My visa. The academy has resources, Professor Chen assured her. International students often need assistance with such matters. Which he means they have very good lawyers, Eleanor added with a wink. Professor Chen handed Sophia a thick envelope. All the details are here. The scholarship covers tuition, of course, but there's also a small stipend for living expenses. Not much, I'm afraid. Sophia stared at the envelope in disbelief. After weeks of hunger and fear, of wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake in coming to America, this piece of paper represented everything she had hoped for. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Eleanor suggested, her eyes twinkling. Yes, Sophia echoed. Yes, of course. As they left the academy, the gray skies finally opened, rain pouring down in sheets. Neither woman had brought an umbrella, but Eleanor just laughed, taking Sophia's arm as they ran to the bus stop. We should celebrate, Eleanor declared once they were huddled under the shelter, raindrops dripping from their hair. Dinner at Angelo's, my treat. Sophia looked at her in surprise. The restaurant? Where I played? Exactly. I spoke with Raj yesterday. He's been asking about you. I think he's hoping you might become a regular feature. The bus arrived, its windows fogged with the breath of passengers. They found seats near the back, Sophia carefully placing her violin case on her lap. I don't understand, Sophia said once they were settled. Why would he want me to play there again? He has a sound system, Eleanor smiled. Because you brought something to that place it was missing. Something real. She nodded toward the violin case. That's what music can do when it's honest. It transforms ordinary spaces into something special. The bus wound its way through rain-slick streets, past office buildings where lights were already coming on against the early darkness. Sophia watched the city through the wet window, thinking about how different it looked now compared to just 4 days ago, when she'd been lost and alone. "You transformed my life," she said quietly to Eleanor. "Why, you don't even know me." Eleanor was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on something distant. "When I was younger than you," she finally said, "I had a teacher who saw something in me that no one else did, not even myself. He gave me chances I didn't deserve, pushed me when I wanted to give up." She turned to Sophia. "I've had a fortunate life in music, but if Gustav hadn't taken a chance on me, I might have been the one playing for meals." The bus stopped near the restaurant, and they hurried through the rain to the familiar entrance. The place was busy, even in the early evening, with waiters moving efficiently between tables. Raj spotted them immediately. His face lit up with recognition. "The violinist," he exclaimed, coming forward to greet them. "And Mrs. Whitman. Please, I have saved the best table." He led them to a corner spot partially screened by plants, private but with a view of the entire restaurant. A small reserved sign sat on the white tablecloth. "You were expecting us?" Eleanor asked, amused. Raj looked slightly embarrassed. "I may have called the academy today to ask about the audition." At Sophia's surprised expression, he added, "My niece studies piano there. I have connections." As they settled at the table, Sophia noticed something different about the restaurant. A small area near the bar had been cleared, with a spotlight focused on an empty chair. A microphone stand waited nearby. "What's that?" she asked. Raj followed her gaze and smiled. "Our new live music section. Friday and Saturday nights to start." He looked at her hopefully. "If you're interested, of course. Paid position? Not just for meals anymore." Sophia looked from Raj to Eleanor, then back to the small stage area. 4 days ago, she had stood in that spot, hungry and desperate. Now it was being offered as a beginning, not an end. "I would be honored," she said, her voice steady with newfound confidence. Raj beamed. "Excellent. Now what can I get you ladies to celebrate?" As he bustled off to bring their drinks, Eleanor raised an imaginary glass. "To new beginnings," she said. Sophia smiled, raising her own invisible toast. "And to playing for more than just food." Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, preparing it for whatever might grow next. 6 months passed in a blur of practice rooms, theory classes, and late-night study sessions. Sophia's life had transformed from one of uncertainty to one of exhausting routine. Each morning she woke at 5 to practice before classes. Afternoons were filled with ensemble rehearsals and private lessons. Friday and Saturday evenings she played at Angelo's, where Raj had hung a small sign. "Live Music, Sophia Mendez, International Violinist." The restaurant crowds had grown since she started performing regularly. People made reservations specifically for the nights she played, some returning week after week to hear her mix of classical pieces and folk tunes from her homeland. The pay wasn't much, but combined with her academy stipend, it allowed her to rent a tiny studio apartment just a few blocks from campus. Eleanor visited Angelo's often, usually bringing faculty members or friends from the symphony. Sophia had moved out of her mentor's guest room after the first month, despite Eleanor's protests that she was welcome to stay. "I need to stand on my own," Sophia had explained. Eleanor understood, though she still checked in nearly every day, calling or leaving notes in Sophia's campus mailbox. Today, Sophia rushed across campus, violin case banging against her leg as she ran. She was late for her lesson with Professor Wu, the academy's most demanding instructor. The autumn leaves crunched beneath her feet as she cut across the lawn, taking a shortcut to the East Building. Professor Wu was waiting, his thin face set in disapproval. "You're late, Ms. Mendez." "I'm sorry, Professor. The quartet rehearsal ran long, and then I needed to speak with financial services about—" He waved away her explanation. "Time management is part of a musician's discipline. Unpack your instrument. We'll begin with the Bach." For the next hour, Sophia played while Professor Wu critiqued every nuance, every subtle shift in her bow pressure. It was exhausting, frustrating work. But Sophia knew she was improving under his exacting standards. When the lesson finally ended, her fingers ached and her shoulders burned with tension. "Better," Professor Wu conceded as she packed up. "Still problematic in the middle section, but better." Coming from him, this was high praise. As Sophia left the practice room, Lucia was waiting in the hallway, her own violin case in hand. "You survived," she said with a grin. Wu was actually smiling when he opened the door. "I think he might actually like you," Sophia laughed. That wasn't a smile. That was indigestion. In the months since her arrival at Palmer, Lucia had become Sophia's closest friend. Despite their different backgrounds, Lucia came from a wealthy family of musicians in Boston. They shared a dedication to their craft and a dry sense of humor about the academy's intensity. "Coffee?" Lucia suggested. "I've got a break before orchestra." They walked to the small cafe in the academy's lobby, grabbing the last empty table by the window. Sophia sank gratefully into a chair, stretching her sore fingers. "You look exhausted," Lucia observed, pushing an extra muffin toward Sophia. "When was the last time you took a night off?" Sophia shrugged. "I can't afford to take nights off. Between classes, practice, and the restaurant gigs. That's exactly why you need a break." "When was the last time you did something just for fun?" Lucia reached into her bag and pulled out 2 tickets. "Chamber series at Symphony Center tonight. And before you say no, they're playing Dvořák's American Quartet, which I know you love." Sophia hesitated. "I have theory homework, and I should practice the Paganini for Wu's class." "The theory homework can wait, and you could play the Paganini in your sleep." Lucia placed one of the tickets firmly on the table in front of Sophia. "I'm not taking no for an answer. We'll get dinner first. My treat." Sophia picked up the ticket, feeling a small thrill at the idea of attending a professional concert as an audience member rather than struggling to play for her next meal. "All right, but I'm buying dessert after." Lucia grinned in triumph. "Deal." That evening, dressed in the nicest clothes they owned, Sophia and Lucia joined the stream of concertgoers entering Symphony Center. The grand hall took Sophia's breath away. All golden light and rich wood, the ceiling soaring above rows of red velvet seats. As they found their places, Sophia ran her fingers over the smooth armrests, imagining what it would be like to play on that illustrious stage. "Look," Lucia whispered, nudging Sophia's arm. "Third row center. That's Eleanor with the symphony board members." Sophia spotted her mentor, elegant in a dark blue dress, engaged in animated conversation with an older man in a tuxedo. As if sensing their gaze, Eleanor looked up, scanning the crowd until she spotted Sophia. Her face lit up, and she gave a small wave before returning to her conversation. "Sometimes I forget she's kind of a big deal," Sophia said quietly. "Kind of a big deal?" Lucia raised her eyebrows. "Eleanor Whitman is a legend. Half the conductors in the country studied under her." She studied Sophia with curiosity.
"How exactly did you two meet again?"
"You've never really explained." Sophia was saved from answering by the dimming of the lights. The quartet took the stage to enthusiastic applause. 4 musicians in formal black attire, their instruments gleaming under the spotlights. As they began to play, Sophia felt herself being drawn into the music, the familiar Dvořák melodies washing away the stress of her demanding schedule. During intermission, Eleanor made her way to their seats. "What a lovely surprise," she said, genuinely pleased to see Sophia outside of their usual meetings. "Are you enjoying the performance?" "It's wonderful," Sophia replied. The first violinist's tone in the slow movement was so pure. "Lisa always had exceptional bow control," Eleanor agreed. "Oh, that reminds me, I have news." She glanced around, then lowered her voice slightly. "The symphony is holding special auditions next month for their Young Artists program. 2 positions with the orchestra, part-time while you finish school." Sophia's heart jumped. "But I'm only in my first year at Palmer." "Doesn't matter. It's open to anyone under 25 with the necessary skills." Eleanor's eyes twinkled. "I may have mentioned your name to a few people." The lights flickered, signaling the end of intermission. "We'll talk details later," Eleanor promised, squeezing Sophia's hand before returning to her seat. Lucia turned to Sophia, her expression a mix of shock and excitement. "Did she just say what I think she said? The Young Artist program?" She shook her head in disbelief. "People prepare for years just to get an audition." Sophia stared after Eleanor, a knot forming in her stomach. "I'm not ready for something like that. Are you kidding?" "Of course you are. You're the most talented first-year student Palmer has seen in ages. But I've only been here 6 months. There are technical pieces I haven't even attempted yet." Lucia grabbed Sophia's arm. Listen to me. Most of us have been groomed for this life since we were 5 years old. We've had every advantage, the best teachers, the best instruments, parents who understood what we needed. Her voice grew serious. And still, many of us will never play at the level you do naturally. You have something special, Sophia. Stop doubting it. The second half of the concert passed in a blur as Sophia's mind raced with possibilities. Playing with a professional symphony while still a student was rare. If she succeeded, it could open doors she had never imagined possible. As they left the concert hall, Sophia spotted one of the business suits from her first night at Angelo's, the man who had mockingly encouraged Raj to let her play. He was with his wife, waiting for the valet to bring their car. He didn't recognize Sophia in her concert attire, with her hair styled and her posture confident. She was no longer the desperate girl playing for a meal. Later that night, in her tiny apartment, Sophia sat by the window overlooking the city lights. Her violin lay in its open case on the bed. She picked up her phone and hesitated before dialing the international number she knew by heart. The line rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. "Mama," Sophia said, the word catching in her throat. "Sophia." Her mother's voice came through, distant but clear. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, Mama, everything is good." Sophia took a deep breath. "I have news. I'm at the music academy now on scholarship, and there might be an opportunity with the symphony." Her mother's soft gasp was audible even across the thousands of miles separating them. "Oh, my girl, your father would be so proud." The mention of her father brought a sharp pang. He had been the first to place a violin in her hands, the one who had practiced with her every evening after his work at the university. Before the troubles had started, before he had been taken. "I think about him every time I play," Sophia said quietly. "He is with you." Her mother's voice was firm despite the emotion Sophia could hear in it. "Now tell me everything. How are your studies? Are you eating enough?" Sophia smiled, settling back against the wall. "It all started with a restaurant. I was so hungry, Mama, and I asked if I could play for a meal. They talked for nearly an hour, Sophia sharing stories of Eleanor, of Lucia, of Professor Wu's demanding lessons and Raj's restaurant crowds. It was the longest conversation they had managed since Sophia had fled the country, and each word helped heal a small piece of the homesickness she carried with her. When they finally said goodbye, with promises to speak again soon, Sophia picked up her violin. Despite the late hour and her tired muscles, she felt compelled to play. She chose a lullaby her father had taught her, one he claimed his grandmother had sung in the old country. The simple melody filled her small apartment, a bridge between her past and whatever future lay ahead. As she played the final notes, Sophia made a decision. She would audition for the symphony's Young Artist program, not just for herself but for her father who had sacrificed everything for her music, for her mother who remained brave in his absence, and for Eleanor who had seen possibility in a hungry girl playing for a meal. Sophia placed her violin carefully back in its case. Tomorrow would bring more classes, more practice, more challenges. But for tonight, she allowed herself to feel how far she had come in 6 short months, from playing for food to playing for her future. 3 years later, Sophia stood in the wings of Symphony Center, her heart pounding so hard she feared the audience might hear it. The grand hall was packed for the season's final concert. From her position, she could see only a slice of the crowd, rows of expectant faces, programs rustling, the subtle buzz of conversation. Nervous? Eleanor appeared beside her, elegant as always in her conductor's black. Sophia nodded, clutching her violin. It wasn't the same instrument she'd carried into Angelo's that desperate night. This one was on loan from the symphony's collection, a genuine Guarneri with a voice so rich it sometimes moved her to tears. "Good," Eleanor said with a smile. "Nerves keep us honest." She straightened Sophia's collar slightly. "Remember what we discussed in rehearsal. The cadenza is yours, make it personal." A stagehand approached, nodding to indicate it was time. Eleanor squeezed Sophia's arm once before walking onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. As music director for the Symphony's Young Artist program, Eleanor had worked closely with Sophia these past years, pushing her beyond what any teacher at Palmer had demanded. The applause grew louder as Sophia followed, walking to the soloist's position in front of the orchestra. The stage lights were blinding, the audience a dark mass beyond. She looked instead at her fellow musicians, some former teachers, others now friends, and found her center in their encouraging nods. Eleanor raised her baton. The orchestra began the introduction to Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, the familiar melody washing over Sophia like a warm wave. Then came her entrance, and everything else fell away. There was only the music, the connection between her bow and the strings, the conversation between her violin and the orchestra behind her. The first movement flowed into the second, and Sophia let herself sink deeper into the piece. This wasn't just a performance. It was a story, her story. The struggles, the hunger, the desperation of those early days in America, the kindness of strangers like Raj and Eleanor, the friendship of Lucia, who sat among the first violins tonight beaming with pride, the memory of her father and his belief in her gift. When the third movement arrived, Sophia played with a fire that surpassed even their rehearsals. Her fingers flew across the strings, her bow dancing in perfect control. As she approached the cadenza, the solo passage where the orchestra falls silent, leaving the violinist alone in the spotlight, she took a breath and made a split-second decision. Instead of playing the traditional cadenza, Sophia launched into a variation that incorporated a folk melody from her homeland, the same tune she had played in her Palmer audition years ago. It was daring, perhaps even reckless, to change such an iconic piece, but it felt right. It felt true. For nearly a minute, the hall was filled with nothing but Sophia's violin, singing of home and loss and finding new family in unexpected places. She could feel Eleanor's surprised gaze, could sense the orchestra leaning forward in their chairs. When she returned to Mendelssohn's familiar theme, bringing the orchestra back in with a nod to Eleanor, the transition was seamless, as if the composers, separated by centuries and cultures, had always meant their music to intertwine. The piece ended with a flourish, Sophia's final note hanging in the air for a breath before the hall erupted. The audience rose to their feet, applause thundering against the walls. Someone shouted "Brava!" from the balcony. Flowers appeared on stage, handed to her by the concertmaster. Through it all, Sophia stood blinking in the lights, bow hanging at her side, momentarily stunned by the response. Eleanor stepped forward, extending her hand to lead Sophia in a bow. As they straightened, the conductor whispered, "That cadenza, pure magic." Sophia took her bows, then exited the stage only to be called back for 3 encores. For the final one, she played the simple folk lullaby her father had taught her, the same one she had played alone in her tiny apartment the night she decided to audition for the Young Artists program. When the concert finally ended, the backstage area was buzzing with musicians and well-wishers. Sophia made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations, searching for familiar faces. Lucia found her first, wrapping her in a fierce hug. "You absolute genius," she exclaimed. "I can't believe you changed the cadenza. Professor Wu is probably having a heart attack right now, but it was brilliant." Sophia laughed, the tension of performance finally releasing. "I didn't plan it. It just happened." "The best music always does," said a voice behind them. Sophia turned to find Raj, looking somewhat out of place in the crowd of formal concert attire but beaming with pride. Beside him stood a woman Sophia had never met, with familiar eyes and silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. "Mama?" Sophia whispered, barely trusting her eyes. Her mother stepped forward, hands reaching for Sophia's face. "My beautiful girl," she said in their native language. "My beautiful, talented girl." Sophia fell into her mother's embrace, breathing in the familiar scent that brought childhood memories rushing back. "How?" she managed through her tears. "How are you here?" Raj cleared his throat. "Eleanor and I may have arranged some things. Visa paperwork, flights," he smiled. "She arrived this morning. We wanted it to be a surprise." Sophia couldn't speak, could only hold her mother tighter as 3 years of separation dissolved in tears and whispered endearments. "Your father would be so proud," her mother said, finally pulling back to look at Sophia properly. "He always said you would play on the world's greatest stages." "I wish he could have seen it," Sophia said softly. "He did," her mother replied, touching Sophia's heart. "He was here." Later that night, long after the concert hall had emptied and the musicians had packed away their instruments, a small celebration gathered in Angelo's Italian bistro. Raj had closed the restaurant to regular customers, setting up a private party in the space where Sophia had once played for a meal. The room was filled with people who had been part of Sophia's journey. Eleanor at the head of the table, Lucia and several other musicians from Palmer and the symphony, Professor Chen, who had championed her scholarship, even Professor Wu, who claimed to have forgiven her creative interpretation of the Mendelssohn cadenza. In the place of honor sat Sophia's mother, still looking slightly overwhelmed by the journey and the crowd of strangers who treated her daughter with such respect. She spoke little English, but Sophia translated, watching her mother's face brighten as she understood the stories being shared around the table. "A toast," Eleanor said, rising with her glass, "to Sophia, who reminds us why we make music in the first place, not for acclaim or tradition, but because it speaks what words cannot." To Sophia. The table echoed. Sophia felt her cheeks warm with the attention. "I should be toasting all of you," she said. 3 years ago, I was a stranger in this city, hungry and alone. Now." She looked around the table at the faces of those who had become her American family. "Now I have more than I ever dreamed possible." As the dinner continued, Sophia slipped away to the small stage area, where she still occasionally performed on weekends when her symphony schedule allowed. The special chair was still there, now adorned with a small plaque. Sophia Mendez began her American journey here. She felt a presence beside her, and turned to find one of the businessmen who had laughed that first night, the one who had mockingly encouraged Raj to let her play. He looked older now, his hair graying at the temples. "Ms. Mendez," he said, extending his hand. "Thomas Wilson. I'm not sure if you remember me." "I remember," Sophia said simply, accepting the handshake. He had the grace to look embarrassed. "I was at the concert tonight." "You were extraordinary." He paused. "I owe you an apology for that first night." "I was unkind." Sophia studied him for a moment. "No apology needed, Mr. Wilson. Without your mockery, Raj might never have let me play." Wilson blinked in surprise, then laughed. "A generous perspective." He glanced toward the celebration. "I won't keep you from your guests. I just wanted to say that what you've accomplished is remarkable." As he walked away, Sophia felt a hand on her shoulder. Her mother stood behind her, a question in her eyes. "Who was that man?" Sophia smiled. "Someone who taught me that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best opportunities." They returned to the table together, where Raj was sharing the story of Sophia's first night at the restaurant, for those who hadn't heard it before. Sophia sat between her mother and Eleanor, the two women who represented her past and her future, feeling the full circle of her journey. Later, as the evening wound down, Eleanor pulled Sophia aside. "I have something for you," she said, handing over a large envelope. Inside was an official letter from the symphony board, offering Sophia a permanent position as a first violinist following her graduation from Palmer in the spring. "They were going to wait until next week to tell you," Eleanor explained. "But after tonight's performance, I convinced them you deserve to know immediately." Sophia stared at the letter, tears blurring the formal text. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Eleanor suggested with a smile. "And then say you'll still play here sometimes." She gestured around the restaurant. This is where it all began, after all. Sophia looked around the room, at Raj directing his staff to bring more dessert, at her mother deep in conversation with Professor Chen, who apparently knew a few words of her language, at Lucia demonstrating something to the younger students with animated hand gestures. This unlikely group, brought together by chance and music, had become her world. "Yes," Sophia said, tucking the letter carefully away. "To both." Outside, the Chicago night was alive with city lights. Inside Angelo's Italian bistro, a young woman who had once played for a serving of food raised her violin one more time, filling the room with music that needed no translation, the sound of hunger satisfied, of dreams fulfilled, of a journey completed and new ones just beginning.